What? I'm talking to the police, Mommy. Stop it! Mommy! Stop it! Don't take the baby! Don't think you're gonna hurt the baby! Stop it! Could you just send the police, please?
Okay, we're gonna be there. We're taking your baby.
Hello again, everybody, and welcome to a very special segment of Public Praise TV. Today, we're going to talk about a subject that is kind of taboo within the Christian community, and that is domestic violence. And here to join me to talk about this topic is the founder of Love Life Now Incorporated, Lovern Gordon. Thank you. Thank you for being here.
Gosh, I'm glad to be here.
It's amazing. So tell me a little bit about your organization.
Sure. Love Life Now came about many years ago through a beauty pageant that I took part in. Initially, locally, I was dared by some friends to take part in it and ended up winning and had to go on to nationals to represent there as well, and ended up winning in that leg as well. With 2 titles on hand, I had to pick a platform that was really near and dear to my heart to champion for over the next year. And domestic violence was an easy choice because I have history with it as a child witness and an adult survivor of it. So after the year was up, using the title to advocate in any which way possible for victims and survivors, I wanted to carry on the work beyond the title. And so I realized I wasn't a pageant girl, but I really wanted to continue this work. And people had said to me, well, you should start a nonprofit. And I did, and Love Life Now was formed. And so we seek to empower victims and survivors through awareness initiatives that we put on throughout the year that get people out and about talking about the issue, being aware of the ways that they can be part of the solution, and as well as helping shelters and agencies do the work that they do on a daily basis to aid victims and survivors. And so we do that through these initiatives that we host. Each of them benefit a shelter, and so we're able to give back to the agencies and the shelters that, as I mentioned, do the real work.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So tell me, why is domestic violence such a taboo issue within the Christian community?
Yeah. You know, I mean, you're taught that you're supposed to exhaust every avenue possible when it comes to issues within your marriage, which would possibly include domestic violence. I mean, you know, you don't talk about it, but you know it's happening. And so a lot of the times we hear from pastors, clergymen, you know, let's talk about it. And what folks don't necessarily understand is that this isn't an issue that you can solve by talking through it. Domestic violence is a learned behavior. And so when you have someone that is exhibiting abusive behavior, they're not necessarily ever going to unlearn it by sitting down and talking. They need professional help. And the person that's being abused needs to get as far away as possible, which would more often than not include divorcing their abuser or being away from their abuser in a safe place. And so that would mean breaking up a marriage, which is so, you know, such a, you know, sanctified thing in the Christian community. So I think a lot of the times we'd rather not bring it up. We'd rather not say that it's happening, that it's a huge problem just within the community. But I know that, you know, a lot of people are suffering and staying in relationships they don't have to be in just to please clergymen. And it's dangerous for the victims. It's dangerous for their children if there are children involved, and it's unhealthy every which way you look at it.
So you mentioned before that you had experienced domestic violence in your past.
Yeah.
Could you Tell me a little bit about that.
Sure. So I grew up on the island of Trinidad, and I lived there for 15 years. And for the 15 years that I lived there, from the very first time I knew myself, I knew my mom being a victim at the hands of my father, who she was married to up until his passing of natural causes in 2002. And you know, when we talk about domestic violence in the Caribbean back in the 80s, first of all, the term domestic violence wasn't even coined yet. And here you are living in a third world country with this issue being so prevalent every which way you turned. I mean, my father would come home from work and you know, back then you weren't necessarily sure what was going to trigger him to set off an attack on her. But he would come home and he would beat her. And when we talk about beating, I'm not talking about just slap or kicks here and there. I'm talking about machetes that he would chop her with. And we're talking about beer bottles that he would break and stab her with. And so, you know, it was gruesome stuff that me and my 4 other siblings witnessed throughout the span of their marriage. And a lot of the times she would run. Sometimes she would take us and run with her. But he would always find us. He knew her hiding spots. He knew all of her friends. And he would come, not necessarily bearing gifts, but, hey, listen, come on home. It's over. You know, it's all good now. So, you know, she would always go back. Many, many years later, I asked her, I said, why did you always go back? And she said, well, 5 children, no education, little to no education. How would I take care of you guys? She said, and at the core, I loved him. And I'm not sure if at the time I respected what her answer was, but I seem to understand it for you know, lack of a better term. So yeah, so you know, it was brutal beatings that we watched day in and day out a lot of the times. And fast forward many years later, I said that would never be me. Throughout the time that I was a child watching this happen, I kept saying, I would never let anybody treat me the way that he treated her. Unfortunately, children that grow up watching domestic violence situations, they end up being the abused or the abuser. And I became the abused subconsciously. I fell into a relationship when I moved to the States back in 1999 for about 2 years. And for about 3 months, it was what we call the honeymoon phase, trying to reel me in with the, you know, the flowers and the gifts and the dates and the really nice courting stage. And about 3 months into the relationship, he slapped me for the first time. And I said, you know, he stormed out after he did it. And I said, you know what? I'm not sure why I let this happen to me, but it's never going to happen again. A weekend passed, and I hadn't seen him because I took a trip and went away, and came back, and he delivered 2 dozen purple roses, which was it still is my favorite color, and a card, and tons of messages on my phone. And immediately I went back to situations that my mom and dad had experienced and said to myself, well, my dad never apologized to my mom the way he's trying to. Maybe he does mean it. You know, maybe he understood what he did was wrong. And that right there, me taking it back, accepting that apology, started a cycle of 2 years of abuse. Too often people ask the question, well, why did she stay, or why didn't she leave? And domestic violence isn't a black and white issue. There's so many layers to it as to why you stay. I mean, at the time I was, for lack of a better word, independent. But psychologically, all the wounds and the scars from watching what my mother went through was still laying there. And so peeling back those layers and understanding that, you know, how easy it was for me to fall into that type of situation is that it can really happen to anybody, especially if you've gone through it as a witness, being a child witness to it.
So I have one last question for you, and how would you tell a victim that is going through domestic violence right now? How would you let them know how to get out?
First of all, every situation is different. And so you approach it in a way I'll say this, 7 to 10 times, it takes a victim 7 to 10 times to really exit an abusive relationship. First thing I would say is get in touch with your local advocate through a domestic violence agency. They're everywhere. If you called 1-800-799-SAFE, it's the easiest way to find out where your local shelter or agency is. There, advocates are trained and ready to help you create a safety plan, depending upon your situation, to help you exit that relationship safely. And it may sound like, you know, something that you could probably do yourself, but there are so many layers to exiting safely. You know, documents that you need to prepare, people that you need to contact, things that you can do to keep you or your children safe during the process. And so that would be my first thing. But the biggest thing out of everything is to make that decision to want to leave. It's easier said than done, but for victims, it's a hard bridge to cross. Really finally deciding that the known that you're facing right now is hell compared to the greatness that you'll face on the other side that you're thinking is the unknown. And that a lot of times is scary for victims. Well, he's or she has, you know, taken care of me financially for the last 5, 6, 7, 8 years. How am I going to do this on my own? What kind of resources are out there? Are there any resources? Well, who's going to take care of my children? Well, I'm an immigrant. He's probably going to call, you know, immigration on me. You know, just so many reasons why victims end up staying and enduring these types of relationships. So yeah, I would say the first thing would be to make the decision and then call 1-800-799-SAFE.
From the bottom of my heart, I want to thank you for being here to talk about this very important issue that affects everyone.
And I'll point out, Dima, that 1 in every 4 women will be abused in their lifetime. The problem with that statistic is that none are speaking up, which makes it that much harder to combat. So I urge you to find someone that you trust and tell them. Again, if you pick up the phone and call 1-800-799-SAFE, you can do so anonymously. You don't have to give names. You probably don't want your abuser to get in trouble, and they won't. Just find out ways that you can make yourself safe, you and or your children.
Thank you, Lovern, for sharing that with me, and hopefully this information could save a life. So we'll return with more of Public Praise TV.